This is a production of Cornell University.
So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon to our seminar with Leah Penniman. I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to join us and putting aside your other duties and responsibilities and worries for a moment and to sit together in a conversation and a contemplation of what diversity looks like in agriculture, what it is, what it could look like, and how we can contribute to that. So I want to first start by thanking our sponsors for today. We had several organizations that helped contribute to hosting this event. I first want to highlight the Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. This is a student group on campus, and I'm so excited to see them revived and here and present again. And so we'll be hearing a little bit more from them in a while. The Cornell Small Farms Program is extremely proud to be hosting this. The Center for Conservation Social Sciences, the Community Food Systems minor, and the School of Integrated Plant Science. So thanks to all of the sponsors that helped make this happen. So just a little process after we hear from Leah. We're going to have a panel discussion that's facilitated by one of the Manners students, Marquand Jones. And we'll have Scott Peters and Shorna Allred and Rafael Aponte and I join Leah in that panel conversation. And so we hope at that point we can reflect some more on the seminar and steps and thoughts for moving forward. So I ask you right now to please silence your cell phones. Turn them off if you could. If you could give that up, it would be wonderful. Take a deep breath and just exhale. Come into this room and set aside your worries and your duties and reach inside to that part of yourself that really represents your best self. It's from this place that I ask you to look around and connect with the wealth of experience, the diversity of experience, and the wisdom that's in this room. And think about how it's this connection to each other and to the land and to our histories and our stories. And this is at the core of what Leah Penniman shares with us and brings forth in her work. I'd like to read a couple of passages from her book that have really resonated with me, just to sort of set the stage for this afternoon. And for those of you who would like to purchase a copy, Leah's brought some copies with her and they're in the back. And so you can actually purchase one of the books, and I have some, you can take a look later. 100 years of enslavement have devastated our sacred connection to the land and overshadowed thousands of years of our noble, autonomous farming history. Many of us have confused the terror of our ancestors experienced on the land with the land herself, naming her the oppressor and running toward paved streets without looking back. We do not stoop, sweat, harvest, or even get dirty, because we imagine that would revert us to bondage. And yet we are keenly aware that something is missing, that a gap exists where there once was a connection. Another quote that I found really resonant and moving is this one, and I have edited a little just to provide context. Learning about George Washington Carver, Fannie Lou Hamer, Booker T. Watley, and the new communities of Georgia, I realized that during all those years of seeing images of only white people as stewards of the land, only white people as organic farmers, and only white people in conversations about sustainability, the only consistent story I'd been told about Black people and the land was about slavery and sharecropping, about coercion, brutality, misery, and sorrow. And yet, there's an entire history blooming into our present in which Black people's expertise and love of the land and one another was evident. I feel so good. I found my purpose in the land. I personally really resonate with this story because as a child, as a brown girl, an immigrant, and an outsider, it was in connecting and tending a garden that I found purpose and meaning. That physical and spiritual connection offered to me was freely given by soil and sunlight and the plants that I was growing, but it engendered a type of personal agency and self-efficacy that I couldn't get in a classroom. And I feel that that quote, honoring and sort of elevating the roles of many historical Black scientists, is largely missing on this quad. It's largely missing in the way that we think and talk about agriculture and history, and it's invisible, and it's invisible in the coursework and our collaboration in the field. So what is it that we can do? How can we think and propel our own work forward, especially by imagining how bringing different perspectives into the room will really help all of us grow? So in writing Farming While Black, Leah has created a very approachable and engaging guide for reconnecting with our roots, the land, and each other. She invites Black and Latinx people to reconnect to the land, to heal wounds past and present, and to understand the power of good, hard work, and to uplift spiritual connections to ancestral wisdom and other ways of knowing. She's outlined a path into farming that's an antidote to the painful associations of agriculture with slavery, oppression, and land loss and discrimination. And it provides many, many different ways for Black, Latinx, and all of us to think together about how we can help each other reclaim these places of dignity and activate our roles in the food system. While the book is entitled Farming While Black, I feel that it invites any reader to really consider the ways we connect to nature and the land. And that power of that connection to the land is and always will be transformative. So Leah and her ever-growing family that operates Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York, have been at it since 2011. She co-founded Soulfire Farm with the mission to end racism in the food system and to reclaim our ancestral connection to the land. Leah is part of a team that facilitates a powerful food sovereignty program, including farmer training for Black and Brown people, subsidized food distribution program for people living under food apartheid, and regional organizing towards equity in the food system. So with that, I want to welcome Leah and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks everyone for having me. Do y'all know what FOMO is? What's FOMO? So that's what I'm feeling because I've been farming for 22 years and I've never taken a single agricultural class. And you all get to immerse yourself in this amazing environment of just wisdom and research and knowledge. So I'm wishing right now that I could relive my college years and be hanging out with you all. But I do have that real life experience. I've been farming since I was a teenager, and it's really a blessing to be amongst all of you because farmers are my people. They're the only ones who really get it. You know what I mean? Get it. So we're going to go on a little journey and talk about Black agrarianism and how to heal the food system. But for anyone who identifies as African American or who's been close to folks who are Black, you know that we don't start any type of event without a certain acknowledgement first. What is that? You got it. Yeah, the ancestors. We pour libation, we give a shout out to the ancestors because none of us got here by ourselves, right? None of us arrived here without the support and legacy of generations. And so we always acknowledge the ancestors before we speak. And I want to call into the room one particular ancestor of mine. Her name is Susie Boyd. She's my grandma's grandma's grandma. And she lived in the 1700s in what is now Ghana, West Africa. And like so many people were experiencing that time, the community was being ravaged. It was being kidnapped. People were being kidnapped and transported in the transatlantic slave trade to the Turtle Island to do forced labor. Of course, there were no report back, so people don't know exactly why folks were being rounded up. But there was a lot of fear. My family fled to Krobo Mountain, which is a fortified mountain in the hills west of Lake Volta in Ghana. But still, folks were getting stolen in the night and so on. So what the women in the community decided to do, facing this uncertain future, was to gather up their millet, their sorghum, cowpea, black rice, agusi melon, sesame, all these seeds that they had been saving for generations. And they hid them in the parts of their braids and their children's braids because they believed against odds in a future of tilling and reaping on soil, and they believed that they would have descendants who needed to inherit that seed. They had foresight. Right? They didn't give up on us, and in turn, we are not to give up on the future generations who need us. Right? So I invite you to also, I'm calling in Susie Boyd, I invite you to think of an ancestor who had foresight for you. And at the count of 3, we are going to say their names really loud all at the same time. 1, 2, 3. Ashe. So another thanks that we always give before we get too far is a land's acknowledgements. And I'm going to acknowledge the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican people because that's where my farm's at. And while I do have indigenous heritage as a Taino person, I am not Mohican, so I am enjoying some settler privilege. And it's not enough to name it. It really demands solidarity and work towards rematriation. So we've been collaborating with the Mohican folks. I was out at the reservation in Wisconsin last weekend to collaborate with them on how to get some lands back, how to get some seeds back, and really show up for them. So I want to know who you all need to acknowledge. Whose land are we on? Cayuga. Can anyone say a little bit about the Cayuga Nation?
People of the Great Swamp.
Yeah.
And also they happen to be the only nation of the 5 nations of the Confederacy that doesn't have their own treaty land acknowledged now. They have red lands.
Okay, so we got to work on that, right? Very good. Thank you. Thank you. And the third shout out that we give, the third thanks, is to our team. Because we have this little weird individualism disease sometimes in the West where we think like the civil rights movement equals Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which of course it doesn't, right? There's always a team. There's always a squad. There's always a crew. And in the case of Soulfire Farm, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment, you know, this is our team plus a few. So I just want to bring into the room Amani and Larissa and Demaris and Letitia, and also all the people who are feeding your chickens and nursing your babies and paying your taxes and doing whatever else needs to be done so you can be here, because we're always part of a team. And that's the thanks I want to give. And now I'm going to tell some stories. Anyone Haitian in the room? Okay, so how do we start our stories? I say creek, and you all say crack. So creek, creek. Very good, thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our farm first before we get into some history, just so you know why it is that even I'm the one talking to you all about this. So I've been farming, like I mentioned, since I was 16 years old. Back in '96, I got a job at the Food Project outside of Boston, Mass. And I was one of those young people that they saved, you know, from myself. Farming really saved my life. And from there, I just kept trying to get jobs in the summertime. Worked at Many Hands Organic Farm. I worked at farm school. I worked for the community gardens in Worcester, Mass. And eventually decided to start my own farm after getting years and years of experience. And what catalyzed that was this one moment when my husband, Jonah, and I were living in the south end of Albany, which is a food apartheid neighborhood, meaning that no matter how hard you try, you're not gonna be able to get fresh food. No grocery stores, no farmers markets, no available community garden plots, no public transportation. So I have a master's degree. I know how to farm and I know how to get what I want. I could not get fresh food for my newborn and my 2-year-old. So what I ended up doing was joining a farm share CSA that had a drop off 2.2 miles up a hill. So I would put one baby in the stroller, one in the backpack, go up there and pile the heavy fall vegetables onto the children, you know, and then roll back down the hill. So that was the only way to get fresh food. And when our neighbors found out that we knew how to farm, they were like, so you all know how to grow food and you're not doing it for us? Let's get going. So Soulfire was really born out of a community clamor for a farm for the people. We got some really crappy lands, really cheap up in the hills of Grafton, New York. All the farmers down in the valley were like, you cannot grow vegetables on that land. It's like class 13, whatever, really bad. But these are vegetables. They're beautiful because we used all Afro-Indigenous methods to heal the soil, which we'll get into what those are. And what's different about our distribution system is that we box up all these vegetables, right? Every Wednesday from June to November, we put them in this creepy white van that's less creepy because of the sticker slightly and the cute teenager who was the baby, now big. And we do doorstep delivery. So we deliver in neighborhoods where there are not supermarkets or farmers markets or fresh food. And people pay what they can afford on a sliding scale. So folks who have more money pay more, folks who have less money pay less, kind of evens out. Our farm does make money, so that's very important and very challenging for a small scale vegetable operation. But we have 80 acres and we intensively cultivate about 2.5 in vegetables and 2.5 in pasture raised poultry and orchard. So that's the situation. We have 100 CSA members, about 350 individuals. So out of having a farm, which is enough work, we started getting a lot of calls from people. We got calls from parents who said, it's nice to get your food. However, my child is being harassed by the police all summer because they have nothing to do. And they're getting picked up for loitering or petty crimes. Like, you need to do something for the Black and brown youth in Albany. Help us, right? We started getting calls from people saying, I would love to be a farmer, but I can't find a culturally respectful place to work. I can't find a place where I don't experience microaggressions. I'm getting rejected from incubators. I can't afford ag university, all of this. Can you train me how to farm? So we realized we need an educational component. So we started a lot of things. We have a youth program. We have a alternative to incarceration program, a camp, training programs for Black and brown farmers. Like, basically thousands of people are just rolling through the farm, learning various things, anything from a one-day workshop to a one-year apprenticeship. And in addition to teaching folks fun things like cation exchange capacity, we also specialize in looking exceptionally fly while hanging onions, as you can see. And so we did this for a few years, right? The education part. And then we get a challenge from an elder in our community. His name is Baba Curtis Mohammed. He's a civil rights veteran, former Black Panther, experienced a lot of physical violence against his family in the 60s, and eventually moved to Brazil to escape kind of the nutsness of the United States. So he came up to visit our farm for dinner one time, and he was like, oh, this is cute. You know, y'all growing vegetables and chickens, and there's young people. That's really nice. Do you know what real farmers do? He's like, real farmers are the backbone of the civil rights movement. You know, real farmers in the 1960s provided all the housing, the food. They leveraged their land as collateral for bail money to get folks out of jail, the activists. Like, the Black farmers, because they own their own land, they couldn't be fired from their job, so they could register to vote, join the NAACP, join a picket line with comparatively less threat than the sharecroppers. And, you know, you'd go in the South and you'd peer into the windows of these houses with Black farmers back in the late 60s, and it would look like Bible study. But it wasn't Bible study, because in the Bibles were voter registration pamphlets. They were organizing meetings, right? And if folks caught wind that night riders were coming to try to string up the activists, the farmers would go cut down trees to block the road so that people had time to escape. He's like, literally, there would be no civil rights movement without landowning Black farmers. It would not have happened. It's not like you could get a hotel convention center for the NAACP in Georgia. It didn't happen, right? So he was like, you need to make sure that you're providing this resource for the movement. And so that's when sort of the third and, for now, final branch of what we do at Soulfire came about, is really making sure that our land was available for New York State Prisoner Justice Coalition, CAMI, you know, all of these organizations that are doing organizing work, as well as our own anti-racist organizing. So this is one such meeting. Some of the projects we do, we have a reparations map, which matches donors to Black farmers to transfer anything from a hug to a tractor. We have land trust that we're forming in the Northeast, and we'll be doing a workshop about that tomorrow, but it's a collaboration between Black, Indigenous, and Latinx farmers to try to do land reparations. So a lot of projects that are more on the organizing side of things. We weighed in on the Farm Bill, weighing in on the New Green Deal, that type of stuff. And then we have international comrades in 4 places outside of our borders. So Puerto Rico, Haiti, Ghana, and Mexico. We have sibling farms, and every year we provide volunteer support funds to support things like, this is a peanuts growers collective. There's a mango growers collective in Haiti that we help them out with whatever they need. So that is a little bit about Soulfire, and you can see why I'm so fired up and passionate about the work. But it took a long time to get there. Like, I almost quit farming when I was around 18, because I would go to every single farming conference. I would dutifully read every single book that Chelsea Green Publishing put out. And I did not see one person of color present as an expert, one person write a book. And I actually got challenged from people in my community, like, why are you focusing on trees and soil? Like, you should be focusing on gun violence and housing and education, like real issues. You're a traitor, you know, you're a traitor to us. And that's pretty compelling. And so I almost quit farming. And luckily the earth and the ancestors were trying to call me back in. And I had one person. Do you all know Karen Washington? Karen Washington is a Black farmer at Rise and Root Farm. She also started the Black Urban Growers Network. She met me as a teenager. And she was like, don't give up. Like, one day we will have a conference. One day we will have books. Like, it's going to happen, you know? And she was right. She was really right. So Farming While Black is about the other side of Black agrarian history, not just the slavery side of it. And it is a love letter to that teenage self that needed to know that she belonged. So hopefully it's a love letter to the next generation. This is a painting that my sister made of the moment of braiding the seeds into the hair. Anyone get their hair braided by their parents or aunties? Okay, so what happens while you're getting the braids in? Yanking and hitting, but what else happens? If you're tender-headed, you're like, ah. It takes a long time, right? So while you're doing the braids, you're telling stories, you're sharing culture, you're sharing information. And so my belief is that while our ancestors were in West Africa hiding those seeds in their hair, they were also getting a lot of information about the right way to farm, to be in relationship with the earth, and to be in relationship with community. And the project of colonization has been to try to make us forget. And the project of our liberation is remembrance. So I will tell you what was getting braided into our hair, but first I want to see what you already know, okay? So I'm curious what Black agrarian practices you currently use on your farm or garden or that you're studying. And I'll give you some clues, some themes, right? Do you know any Black soil testing practices? Maybe Black crop selection, livestock practices, tools, preservation methods, land ownership, marketing, any strategies that have come out of Black history that inform your farming. So I'm gonna give you 2 minutes to talk to the person next to you. Don't be scared, you don't have to marry them, just 2 minutes. And then I'll ask for a couple of folks to just share out, and then I'll give you the answer. So it's no stress, no test or anything. Okay, 2 minutes. When I say free the people, you say free the land. Free the people. When I say free the people, you say free the land. Free the people. Free the land. By any means necessary. All right, who's brave?
Maybe actually mounds, so you can show moisture and temperature in a smaller pot.
So mounding to manage moisture and temperature. Excellent. What else? I don't know is a fine answer too. Yeah.
Well, I came to the conclusion that like it hurts not to know. Like,
Yeah.
my ambition to like it hurts not.
Yeah. So our comrade saying it hurts not to know because our land was taken, history was taken. One more person want to share? Yeah, sure.
You mentioned George Washington Carver, and soil remediation is right up there. Yeah. Nitrogen fertilizers. Yeah. Well, not fertilizers. Green manure.
Yeah. So Dr. George Washington Carver and green manure. Yeah, we'll definitely get to that. So you all know some things. It's awesome. But not all the things. So I can't dismiss the class. So here we go. Let's start with just crops. You know, there's many crops that come from the continent itself, and then there's a lot of crops where varieties were refined by enslaved Africans. So things like green glaze, collards, and the Mohammed tomato. You know, tomatoes and collards do not come from Africa, but a lot of the varieties that have been popularized were grown by enslaved Africans and plant bred by enslaved Africans. But these crops here actually come from the continent. So okra, coffee, kola nut, black rice, many, many types of melon, eggplants, cotton, sesame, gourds, and so on. So many of us do grow those crops. So these soils, I love this picture because I had the foresight to save some soil from when we first got to our land. In my left hand is 2006. In my right hand is 2018. Everyone said we couldn't grow there. It was completely deforested, it was eroded, it was overgrazed, the rocks were showing through. You know, you get through this much topsoil and then you would hit this hard pan clay, which is what you can see there. And the organic matter was around 2.5%. It's now 12%. And why that's so significant is because when Europeans first got to the United States, on average, the soils in the Great Plains were around 8 to 10% organic matter. And you all know organic matter is like the life. Carbon is the life of the soil. Within one generation, 28 years, the average soil organic matter in the Great Plains was between 3 and 4%. So more than half was tilled right out of the soil and pushed up into the atmosphere. This is before the Industrial Revolution. So most of the times when we look at atmospheric CO2 graphs, we start with that. But the first spike was actually the tilling of the Great Plains. And our farm manager, Larissa Jacobson, says that her life's work is calling carbon back to the soil, which I love. So every % organic matter increase is her manifesting her destiny work. I also love this picture because almost everything you need to know about soil, you can learn through your 5 senses. So the Yoruba people in Nigeria know how to test soil with their tongues, can tell pH down to the difference between 6.5 and 6.0 by how sweet or sour the soil is. Measure pH with our tongue. I've tried it. I haven't trained my tongue. I can like imagine that I can taste the difference, but not really. Has anyone done texture by feel? That also comes out of West Africa, determining the particle size of the mineral portion of soil, how gritty, how smooth, how long the ribbon is. In fact, Western scientists have, gone to Africa and been like, oh my goodness, their soil classifications are as complex as ours. How could it be? Right? But a lot of the things that we know about soil are rooted in Afro-Indigenous practice. Does anyone manage their soil to encourage earthworms or do vermicomposting? They're pretty great, right? So Cleopatra started that. 59 BCE in Egypt. Cleopatra recognized that earthworms were the key to the fertility of the Nile River Delta. And so she made it illegal to harm an earthworm on pain of death. You actually would be put to death if you hurt an earthworm, which is terrifying because it's very easy to hurt one. And she had a whole cadre of priests whose full-time work was dedicated to the study of the habits of earthworms and how to increase them. In 1949, USDA researchers went over and did soil cores and were like, oh my goodness, there's 10 to 40 times the amount of worm castings here as there are in our soils. And it was because of basically Cleopatra sheet vermicomposted her entire empire to make sure that there would be the fertility that we have. So we can thank her for why these little children in Canada are happy with the red worms there. These women are in Ghana, West Africa. And something that's so profound about their soil management is that you can do soil cores there down 700 years, and the core looks like rings of a tree because every generation is responsible for adding to the depth of the dark earth. And dark earth is a combination of bone char, kitchen scraps, waste from the fields, ash from the fire, all combined and composted in a certain way. And every person, every generation needs to lay down a certain depth to that dark earth so the soil gets deeper and better each year. So you can soil core it and you can measure the age of the community by the rings of the earth. So we can thank women in Ghana for our understanding of compost. So this doesn't look very good, right? What is this? Slash and burn, right? That's exactly how I was taught. It was like the enemy of the earth, like slash and burn agriculture. What I didn't know is that Swidden agriculture, which is the more respectful name for slash and burn, is actually an ancient and super sustainable farming technology the way it was originally conceived. It's a 20 to 30 year crop rotation with the forest as the cover crop. And so you farm a certain area for a year or two, right? And then as the soil becomes depleted, move to a new area such that the entire rotation takes a generation to get back to that original plot. In the meantime, a forest regrows. And as we know, forests do a great job of pulling minerals out from deep in the earth, putting down leaf litter, you know, as compost and completely regenerating the carbon stores in the soil. So that by the time you get back, it actually does make sense to go ahead and burn and release those nutrients and make them available. The challenge is colonialism. When you steal people's land and push them into a tiny little space, those rotations that used to take a generation now take just a couple of years. Not sustainable. That's how it got the name slash and burn, and how indigenous people got othered and demonized as enemies of the earth, when in fact it was colonization that was forcing folks to use the land in that way. So every time I do crop rotation, I thank indigenous folks in Africa, as well as Southeast Asia and Turtle Island, for the genius that is Swidden agriculture. So we thank folks for crop rotation. Is anyone into permaculture? Okay, good. Then I'll only be unpopular with 3 people. Because this is the part that people don't like. So permaculture doesn't really exist, unfortunately. Permaculture is a process of appropriating indigenous technologies from all around the world and putting them under a new heading and then commercializing it, not for the benefit of indigenous people, which is a real bummer. One of the popular, well-known techniques of permaculture is agroforestry. These idea that you can, you know, have woody perennials, and then around them maybe some aromatic herbs that repel pests, and then around that maybe you're grazing your chickens and your annuals and your very, you know, that whole system that is relatively self-sustaining. In Nigeria alone, there's over 30 agroforestry systems that have been documented. One of them made it over to Haiti. It's called the Jardin La Cour. The Jardin La Cour just means home garden. But like any agroforestry system, you have multiple layers of plants. You have perennials and annuals. You have herbs and fruits, moringa and limon. And this here is a nursery that we helped to build in Bigonet in Haiti that provides families with the plants for their agroforestry system, their Jardin La Cour, which everybody has. So we shout out Afro-Indigenous farmers for what we call permaculture as well. And here's us trying to build a Jardin La Cour. Unfortunately, I could not get moringa or mangoes or lemons or any of that to grow. So we just have apples and plums and things like that, which are also somewhat exciting, but not as exciting. But this points out another technology, which is the Terrace, the Terrace, which arose simultaneously in Mesoamerica as well as Eastern Africa. In Kenya, it's called Fanya Juu. Fanya Juu means throw it upwards in Kiswahili. Any idea? I love that name. Any idea why call a terrace throw it upwards? Has anyone made a terrace before? What do you have to do? You throw it down? Well, that's probably saves labor. But on our farm, we did have to throw it upwards because we got this land that was very eroded. So literally at the bottom of the slope, there would be a stone wall, and the soil was all the way up level to the stone wall, above the stone wall. And then below, you'd have like 4 or 5 feet of wall. So you could see how much soil had just washed down the hill visually. So we quite literally dug it up, you know, tractor buckets and whatever, and threw it up to build our terraces. So I imagine that's why they call it that. But this technology, of course, controls erosion. It makes lands that are otherwise not manageable for agriculture, manageable for agriculture. And tools. Almost all of our agricultural tools came from Africa originally. They've been modified, of course. My favorite one is the hoe. The hoe is invented in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the most universal, the most widely used farming tool. You can use it in wetland and dry land, upland and down. You can use it for primary tillage and harvesting and cultivation. I don't particularly like these kind of hoes. I like those like 20-pound honkin' big hose that you can pretty much only get in West Africa or Haiti. So anytime I go, I stuff my luggage with a lot of sharp metal and then negotiate with the airport people on how to get through. But I recommend those. So we give thanks for our tools, right? And we give thanks for irrigation. You know, the oldest irrigation that we know of, again, East Africa, it's the basin system, which is essentially digging a series of canals and ditches and things to flood irrigate. And that's still used in many places around the world. It works well, especially in rice paddies. The next oldest irrigation system is called the Fogara. And that was created a couple thousand years ago in the Sahel Desert in Africa. And it is a people actually hand dug through bedrock to get down to aquifers, and then used a series of air wells to like pump this water over to their date fields. And these are still in use. Like in Algeria, these thousands of year old irrigation systems are still in use. So we give thanks to Black farmers for helping us realize that we could grow food in the desert and giving us the technology to do it. Rotational grazing comes out of the Black community as well. The whole idea, right, that you have your livestock first and they eat a bunch of pests and they go ahead and deposit their manure and fertilizer, move to a new spot, and then you can put your horticultural crops in after that to enjoy and so on, and rotate it around. And gallinaceous birds in particular are rooted in Africa. The very, very oldest domesticated livestock that we have record of is the guinea hen, which is a relative of the chicken. So the guinea fowl goes back as far as any records go that people have been connected to the guinea hen. But Black folks have a neat relationship with the chicken too, which comes out of a problematic history, which is during the time of enslavement, Black people were not allowed to own any bigger livestock. So chickens were not in the law, but things like goats, pigs, cows, that Black people were not allowed to own them. So if you go back to Jefferson's record, like President Jefferson, he would buy all of his chicken from enslaved Africans because that was the only thing they were allowed to raise on their own. But because of that, a lot of the varieties we have of chickens and the methods we have of raising chickens come out of enslaved Africans' methodology. So shout out to Black farmers for the chicken. Any guess how old that tomato is? This guy's in Burundi holding a tomato that he just pulled out of a box of ash. How old do you think it is? Few weeks, few months. It's 6 months old and like super fresh. You could still eat the tomato because preserving in ash and dry soil is a technology for food preservation that's been perfected in Burundi and other parts of Africa, as well as fermentation, smoking, drying, and a lot of the ways that we hold on to our food. You mentioned mounding, raised beds. Raised beds are amazing. I'll tell you a quick story about how, because you know all the ways that we already know they're amazing, like the soil warms up earlier and water management, all that stuff. In 2013, was it Hurricane Sandy in 2013? Which hurricane was that? I lost track. I think it was Sandy. And it like washed away like a bunch of New York City, and it washed away a bunch of farms in the Schoharie Valley. So in the middle of the night during that hurricane, my husband and I woke up simultaneously because it sounded like a Mack truck was coming towards our house. And we looked outside, and where there was once forest, there was now this river just rushing down towards us. And headed straight for our allium fields, like headed for our garlic and our onions and all of that, was gonna wash it all away. So we woke up our children, put shovels in their hand, and made them dig trenches with us to divert the river like around the allium fields, because garlic is a must. Went back to sleep, woke up in the morning, and my little son was so cute. He was about this big at the time, and he was afraid he would drown in the this much water. So he has all the pictures of him. He has a life jacket on while going outside, like just in case he gets washed away. What was amazing is we lost almost nothing. And we lost almost nothing because everything on our farm is in permanent raised beds. And so all the water got slowed down and channelized and absorbed. And it made us really grateful thinking about how these technologies help prevent climate change, but also contribute to climate resiliency in the face of these extreme weather events. And as a bonus, does anyone know what plant is on top of this farmer's mounds? I actually learned this from an audience member. I didn't know. It's Neem. Yeah, which kills nematodes, which is super smart. Things like the work party comes out of Dokpwe in the Dahomey region, or Kombit in Haiti. The idea that we can all get together and help each other out. That's a really important technology too, our social technologies. Credit unions, called Sousous originally, where we all put in a little bit of money and we can take loans out from each other to capitalize our farm, so that if you need to buy a cow, like we're all there for you and we help you buy that cow. Also comes out of a community of Black Caribbean farmers. And our spiritual technologies. So I'll tell you another quick story. I studied farming in Ghana, amongst other places. And there's a group of older Black women there who call themselves the Queen Mothers. Well, they're elected Queen Mothers. They don't call themselves. And they're in charge of the morality of the community. They're in charge of the farms. They're in charge of taking care of the orphans. They're really incredible. And when I was there, they had a fun game to play where they would call me in and ask me about life in the United States on a daily basis. New question every day. So one day they'd be like, Amidede, come. Like, is it true that in the United States, the woman will be stirring the soup pot and the man will be adding salt? Like, yeah, because gender roles are different, right? So they thought that was so funny, like just so funny that we would be collaborating on making soup. Like, who's doing the other stuff? So then the next day they call me and they're like, come, immediately. Is it true that in the United States, the farmer will put a seed in the ground and they will pour no libation, they won't sing, they won't dance, they won't even say thank you to the earth, and then they expect a harvest? Like, is that really true? And of course, it's very true, right? So they said, that's why you're all sick. That's why you're sick. You're sick because you think the earth is a material thing that you can just take, and you don't realize the earth is an orisha, right? The earth is a living being. She's your mother, and she demands reciprocity and consent. So don't come back to Ghana and tell me that you're doing that. Like, I want you to be giving libation, giving honor. So this is us kind of looking very silly, but we're trying to make sure that we honor the spiritual ecology also of farming. First extension agency, Tuskegee University, Black college in Alabama. Booker T. Washington was realizing that a lot of farmers could not get to the university. So the university needed to get to the farmers. Originally with a cart and a mule in the 1800s, went out and I just finished reading this primary source. It's fascinating. It's called The Movable School Goes to the Negro Farmer. It's this like turn of the century, old leather bound, very, very interesting, but about this. And their method was like an extreme makeover reality show. So they would find the crappiest farm with the sickest animals, the like ramshackled house. They would get the whole community to come over and they would like nurse the livestock back to health. They'd fix the fences, they'd prune the trees, they would do erosion control, they'd put cover crops in, and then that became the demonstration site for the community. Super interesting. I read the grant report where they upgraded from a mule and a cart to this car and like how they begged for money and how important it was. So shout out to Tuskegee University for extension. We're pretty into that. Shout out to Booker T. Watley, also a professor at Tuskegee. He came up with the CSA and pick your own. So that whole movement of like direct farmer to consumer, that was not a thing until Watley. At the time, people were doing all middlemen. They were doing commodity crops. They were doing monoculture. And he was noticing that folks were just not making any money. He's like, I have this idea. They thought he was totally nuts. I have this idea. Like, city folks miss the country. We have this big urbanization thing. We need to make them feel like they belong. So we're going to have membership to farms and newsletters so that they feel really connected. And you're going to have farm tours and visits. A lot of things we take for granted as ways that small farmers can make it came out of a Black university under Watley. This is his book, Making $100,000 on 25 acres. That was a lot of money then. George Washington Carver, famous for the peanut. Why was he into peanuts? What family of plants are they in? Yeah, legumes. Legumes are magical, right? Legumes are like, hey, rhizobial bacteria, come over here. I have a nice little home for you in my root. I'm going to feed you sugar. And it's going to have just the right balance of different gases that you need. And all you have to do is turn atmospheric nitrogen into organic nitrogen and feed me. It's a perfect, perfect synergy. And it's why organic ag is possible. So same thing. People thought that George Washington Carver was pretty nuts with his obsession with the peanut and telling farmers that they should take land out of production and put it in leguminous cover crops. That was not a popular idea. So what he had to do to convince people was to quote the Bible. If you look at his speeches, he would be talking in a room like this and be quoting Proverbs and stuff and just be like, like an injustice against the smallest of us is an injustice against everything. So if you disrespect the soil life, you disrespect God. So he was like telling farmers that in the fall, they shouldn't just rest after the harvest. They should go to the swamps and gather up muck and make compost piles and leaves and gather their livestock manure and plant their cover crops. So he was talking about regenerative soil systems a whole generation before the Rodale Institute. He was the first agricultural professor to be teaching organic farming in the United States. Indigenous technologies, yes, but as far as institutionalizing that knowledge and passing it on, that was the beginning. So shout out for organic agriculture itself. The land trust came out of the Black community. This is the first community land trust in Albany, Georgia, 6,000 acres run by 500 families. They were bombed and shot at, and their animals were killed for that audacity as Black people to own land together, but they started the land trust movement. Food hubs. We thank the Barkers and the Black churches in the Southeast for starting the first food hubs. They used to just be in the shed in the back of the church where all the farmers would bring their produce and aggregate it and sell it to congregants. And if they had too much, they'd rent a truck and take it up to Chicago or Pittsburgh along the Great Migration lines, railroad lines, and then sell it out of the churches there. So that was the beginning of aggregation and distribution of perishables by farmers. And here they are winning an award at last year's Black Farmers Conference for their role in the food hub movement. We thank Africa for helping us clean up urban soils. So I'll tell you one more quick story. I'm mostly a rural farmer, but I spent a bunch of time doing urban farming too. And this is Worcester, Massachusetts, where my husband and I, who was then just my friend, we ran the community gardens for the city, and we started a youth farm called Youth Grow. It's still going. It's really great. You should check it out. We had a tiny little baby shortly thereafter and brought her with us. Who doesn't? The baby helps weed. You know, she puts her little bean seeds in the ground. It's very cute. We take her to her 1.5-year-old checkup, and she has lead poisoning. There's no lead in our house, right? She had lead poisoning from contact with the soil. So being the activist mom that I am, I went around and tested the soil for lead all around the city because the city had never bothered to do that. The Environmental Protection Agency's safe limit is 400 parts per million. We found 11,000 parts per million in the drip line in some playgrounds and community gardens, which is like super fund level, obscenely high. So we started a youth co-op. This is called the Toxic Soil Busters. It's a youth-owned business. These are actual hazmat suits. And the young people, we got a contract with the city to clean up, immobilize lead, and to pay the youth to do that work. And our secret weapon is this little flower from Africa called the scented geranium or pelargonium, which is a hyperaccumulator. So if you have lead under about 1,200 ppms, with a year or two of chelation and phytoremediation, you can get that lead level down. And so we would use this geranium to suck that lead out of the soil and fix up our garden areas. So that's just a few examples. There's a lot more. Shout out to Black people for all things organic farming. But I just want to mention briefly too that there are some societal conditions that are preventing us from flourishing. And that's where I hope in the panel we can get into talking a little bit about how to dismantle those boundaries. So number one, access to land. All the land is stolen. All the land that Black people managed to acquire by 1910, almost all of that is gone. And there's a whole history of why that is. It has to do with everything from overt racist violence, like killing people who owned land, to government discrimination. So that's number one thing. You got to have land to be able to farm, right? Number two thing is that nearly all of the labor that we rely on in this country is labor that is somehow exploited or coerced, even indirectly. You know, we create international trade agreements that make life in Mexico or the Caribbean so onerous that folks go across a border to a hostile land to do work for sub-minimum wage that, you know, Americans with documents don't want to do. So it started with slavery, but it's just morphed, right? So we really have to address the dignity that needs to be inherent in farm labor to restore Black agrarianism. We don't get any food to eat, right? If you're Black or brown in this country, you are way more likely to have diabetes, heart disease, obesity, poor eyesight, ADHD, hunger itself. Again, not because we don't know how to make kale salad or like want to eat well, but because of a whole history of housing discrimination, which leads to ghettoization of people, underinvestment in neighborhoods, structural racism that prevents folks from eating good food and also having the purchasing power to buy the good food from the Black farmers in our community. So we need to address the consumer side of things. The fourth thing is, as you know, industrial ag is trashing the planet, and I won't go into that too much. Hopefully we know about that. And we know good methods to farm. We know Black and indigenous regenerative farm methods, but those are either ignored, underfunded, or at best appropriated so that someone else capitalizes on them. And finally, there's a lot of trauma. You know, there's no way that your people can go through hundreds of years of enslavement and sharecropping and lynching and forced migration and not be a little bit jittery around the land. You know, literally everybody, like the young folks who come to my farm at first, their first association is slavery. Even though it's Black and brown people running the farm, they chose to come, they tease each other like, oh, you're a slave, right? That's our first association. And so the work within our communities is to disentangle that association. Like, the land is why we survived all that. She was never the enemy. She was the scene of the crime, but she was never the criminal. And so there's a lot of healing that needs to go on for us to be able to reclaim that dignity. So the question I want to leave you all with, and we can talk about in the panel and the Q&A, is how can we show some more respect, right, to the Black agrarian tradition? And how can we carry on that legacy of the seeds that were braided into our ancestors' hair? I'm going to skip this. I'm just going to close with a quote, and then we'll have like a few questions. And then, so this quote is from Michael Twitty, who's an amazing Black culinary historian. Definitely check out his books if you haven't yet. But I love this. It says, "I need to hear the bumping of pestles making percussion with sunrise and twilights. I need the scratch of grating tubers and the grinding of spices on stone. I need the sonic world of the ancestors, lullabies said while babies are fed body songs as the land is smoothed for planting. I need to understand the sound of the wind and the rice and the complexities of the yam mounds intercropped to save space. I need the rustle of the oil palm fronds so I can hear the generations speak." So thank you.
So how do you, I don't know, do you incorporate any type of like medicinal plants or into your programs and into like your notions of like indigenous, like Latinx and Black, like managing farms?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, being small scale, we're a little blessed that we can get away with all that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of small projects. So in our Jardin La Cou, around our apple trees, we have about 20 or 30 different kinds of medicinal herbs. And we have, one of the things I was meeting with the Mohican folks about is a seed remediation project we're going to do with them. So they don't have as many growers on the reservation as they would like. So we're going to grow out some of their seed and like mail it to them to try to increase, like they have certain varieties of bee balm that are really sacred to them and other crops like that. So we grow Black crops, but we also grow like a lot of indigenous crops too. Yeah, and it's one thing that's so wonderful when youth come, the idea that you can grow your own medicine like blows their mind. So I'm like, oh, you have trouble sleeping at night? Like have some lemon balm and chamomile and just pick it. I'm like, just take it home and make tea. So it has a powerful educational thing too. Like you don't have to rely on CVS for your life.
Any other questions? For like a young Black farmer who would want to start his own her own farm, how do you help them start their own?
Yeah, I mean, I think learning first is really important. And a lot of folks, the first thing they want to do is like get land and start. And I think that can be a recipe for disappointment. And so we have beginner training programs up through more advanced. And then when people graduate, we provide ongoing mentorship. So it's, we nickname it Black Extension, like Black Extension. And so I often will go visit people's farms and help them out and also help them connect to the wider resources. But for a lot of people, the safety of a caucus and an identity group when they're getting started is really important so that as they get ready to kind of branch out into maybe what Small Farms has to offer, what other organizations have to offer. Sure.
Thank you so much for speaking today. I was wondering if you could speak on the research process for your book. I mean, you told us so many beautiful stories, but I'm sure it took a lot of research for you to reclaim and rediscover all this stuff. So,
Definitely. Oh, it was so tantalizing and fun. I never thought of myself as a writer, but it was my favorite thing to do besides pruning trees. So it started with a hypothesis that every single important thing in sustainable agriculture was in some way connected to Black people, and then trying to find it. So I would be like, raised beds, what's the history? And there was an NYU professor named Juliet Tarantino who was my research assistant. So I would say to her something like, I heard that Cleopatra was into worms. Can you find out if that's true and give me like an annotated bibliography of that? So she was very helpful, because you can't just write whatever you feel like writing in a book. You really have to like find the papers. But there's a lot of dense, old like USDA papers and old things that we uncovered. It was really fun. Maybe one more question and then we'll go to the panel. Or zero. It's fine too.
So I want to invite Marquine to facilitate this panel.
Thank you, guys. So yeah, I just want to first introduce myself. My name is Marquine Jones. I'm a junior here at Cornell. I study development sociology, and I'm a community food systems minor and an inequality studies minor. I'm from Chicago, and I have a background in urban farming. So I was really delighted to be here today. So I guess all of the panelists, could you introduce yourselves?
Okay, start again. I'm Scott Peters. I'm a professor in the Department of Development Sociology and work in this newly established community food systems undergraduate minor that Marquine is one of our members of, students of. I teach the capstone course in that curriculum.
Good afternoon. My name is Shorna Allred. I'm a professor in the Department of Natural Resources and the Southeast Asia program, and do research in the environmental justice arena.
Hi, folks. My name is Rafael Aponte. Everybody calls me Rafa. I'm the owner-operator of Rocky Acres Community Farm, 10-acre farm just outside of town. Raise goats, chickens, diversified vegetables, doing education programs and activism.
And I'll just share, Anu Rangarajan. I'm the director of the Cornell Small Farm Program and do research on sustainable vegetable production on 1 to 10,000 acres.
1 to 10. I'm Leah.
All right, guys. So first question, would you please share how your work and research is supporting diversity efforts of farmers in the U.S. or your plans of doing this?
Do you guys need the mic, or do I have to talk into the mic? This is always strange. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll play along. House rules. Well, I used to be able to say that I was the only Black farmer in the county. It's not a proud title, right? But that's no longer true. There's 2 more farmers that have been added to the ranks this year. But previously, I've been the only Black owner operator of a farm within Tompkins County. Now, this is the county that's holding. We're sitting in the land grant institution for the university for the entire state of New York. Yet I was the only farmer, Black farmer, that was an owner of the land that they worked in Tompkins County. So in that way, I'm helping the diversity efforts by putting a number on the board. And I encourage more folks to join me. There are reasons I think that you kind of shine light on that folks aren't engaged or aren't able to get the resources or capital to start these kind of projects. But it's coming along. It's coming along. We need a lot more work though.
I can just share a few efforts within the small farm program and some of the work that we're doing. We're really thinking deeply about how do we strengthen our connections to urban farmers and urban communities of individuals who aspire to farm but don't even have that in their imagination yet. And so we just got a new grant, and we're very excited about it, to work on urban mushroom production and sort of developing collaborative marketing and collaborative opportunities, but then connecting those farmers to farmers upstate New York to start different kinds of conversations that are shared resource, of shared ability, of shared aspiration. We also, that's just one example, but we're thinking a lot about that as a program. And some of the work that I do also goes to South Africa. I work with Black women farmers in South Africa. And that's been a real joy because the connection between what they aspire to and do and to what I observe and experience working with farmers here is really similar.
I just have to say that 3 people who are part of the Northeast Farmers of Color are in the mushroom class and they love it. Like I get text updates, so it's working. Like urban farmers are like, oh, and we went upstate and now I got my bag and all the things. So
Thank you. The second question is, as we have heard in Leah's book and in her lecture, the farming practices that she uses are a combination of indigenous place-based knowledge and most likely oral traditions that have proven to give higher yields and more sustainability. Why do you think researchers have not acknowledged this, and how can you see these coupled together? Is there a way to create an interdisciplinary approach to solving these issues?
So I think that's a really important point. And in Leah's book, and then also in her talk, she really started off by talking about our importance of acknowledging the rich knowledge and history that comes from our ancestors. And I think that often goes unnoticed. And I think there are researchers that are beginning to look at the indigenous knowledge of communities and to really give, to privilege that knowledge in the same way that scientific knowledge is often privileged. And so I think some of that is changing. I'll give a shout out to Gloria Blaze here in the first row. She's a master's student. She's actually doing research in Haiti on agroforestry practices with local communities. So she's going to be, contributing to the science of how communities practice agroforestry, but also helping to spread the models of these community-based approaches to incorporating that kind of traditional knowledge.
So I'll say a few words about the community food systems undergraduate minor. My colleague Rachel Besniker is here, who is leading this as a faculty member and teaches the kind of foundation class in the curriculum. The minor came out of a 5-year initiative that was called Food Dignity. And that project was a partnership with 5 different local food justice projects, one in Oakland, California, 2 in Wyoming, 1 in New York City, and 1 here in Ithaca. And it came from a recognition that there was a lot emerging and happening around the world, that people were, in fact, hard at work in trying to build a just food system. And that institutions like Cornell University didn't know very much about what they were doing, and needed to be in a position of learning, which is the opposite of what we usually think about a university. We're supposed to be the ones teaching, but there was a recognition that there was a lot happening and emerging that required us to be more in a position of learning, but also in a position of using our power, our privilege, our position to access resources that could be offered to those leaders out in those communities. So Food Dignity, we actually got $5 million from USDA for an action research project. And the core of it recognized that the leaders in the local food justice communities were producing knowledge and drawing on large legacies of knowledge, as your work is helping us to learn and know. So the minor came out of that whole experience and is now set up in a way that we hope will help continue to offer ways for students to be contributing through their labor and time and learning, and for us to be finding ways to continue to support the researchers, the knowledge creators, the producers that are out there on the leading edge of food justice work in our communities. And we have a long way to go to be living up to the potential of what an institution like this could do. But with students like Marquand coming into this minor, we're really enthused about the possibilities of doing justice to where the knowledge is and the struggles that people are having in local communities to organize a just food system.
I'll say a piece too. I think we have to come to terms with what industrial agriculture is and how it's tied to capitalism and its ceaseless march, right? And it's effective, it works, right? It's effective at producing capital. What's also effective at is externalizing its harms, right? And that harms most of the times ends up impacting the most marginalized communities. So all the generative projects that end up coming out and the reclamation of history ends up being a response to the harms, right? It pops up where the harms have been done the most. So I wouldn't have got into agriculture. This wasn't a call back to the land for me, you know, out of I wanted to hear more birds. You know, I wanted the pigeons were fine. You know, I wanted my community to eat. You know, I wanted to be able to have healthy access to these things. And looking and talking to my ancestors, to my parents about my ancestors, they were like, "Don't get into this. Like, we came all the way from we don't want you to get back into agriculture. Don't do that." And now they're my biggest fans. They're like, "We're so glad, you know, that you're able to do this because you're able to work on your own terms. You own the means of production. It doesn't come from a place of exploitation." So for me, that works, you know, but the industrial agriculture, it doesn't have to deal with those questions. So I think it's up to us to pose those to them and say, which one works better, right? Under what circumstances? So.
I'll just share a short story that we do a lot of work supporting people getting into farming. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've observed over time is you can teach people you can provide a sort of a recipe for how to do things, but the skill that's the hardest to learn is how to read the land and how to read the environment and integrate to make decisions. And that kind of observation is something that if you haven't had the chance to work alongside with somebody, it takes a long time to learn. Because what you're integrating are all of your senses. You're integrating moving things. You're integrating the signals on the land. You learn to recognize certain plants as representing certain changes on the land. Those are hard to teach. And so that's where I think it's really hard and sad that we have lost some of the connection to elders or to the people that are knowing places. And so we are thinking about that a lot in trying to, in a lot of organizations, how do we help mentor? How do we connect people to mentors that might hold some of this?
So earlier, Leah, you kind of spoke about like there was a point in your life where you wanted to quit and how tough and how hard it was. And I think that's something that can be said about that, because like the work that you guys do is not easy, because if it was easy, everyone would do it. So I could kind of relate to that and kind of my experiences with urban farming in Chicago, and kind of how, you know, there is a stigma behind farming, but like kind of I wanted to know, like, what is all of your why? Like, why do you do what you do? What wakes you up every day to do the work that you do and continue to do it even though it's hard? So yeah.
Yeah, I won't lie to you all. I think about quitting every single year. I bet a lot of farmers do. And I think part of my why, which is not that glamorous, is just stubbornness. You know, there was a moment when my husband and I, we had to hand dig our foundation because we didn't have money for an excavator. We didn't really plan ahead. And it's a passive solar house, so it's got to be facing solar south. I didn't pay attention in earth science. There's a thing called magnetic declination. The compass doesn't point north. It points like 12 degrees off or 13 degrees off. So we dug our foundation wrong. And there was a moment we realized that it was almost done, like 85% done. Took us 4 months with shovels. And Jonah's like, we got to dig this over. What? He's like, do you want to quit? Like, oh, hell no. Do you want to quit? Oh, hell no. Like, we're not quitters. We're like bleeding literally down our calloused hands. Like, 4 more months, we'll dig it. And I think a lot of it is that, but probably more glamorous reason is like whenever I do get really discouraged, I'm like, I always joke with Jonah, I'm just going to go work at the post office because I have this idea that that's easy. I don't know. But there'll be like some young person. So for example, I was giving a talk in Montreal yesterday, and this 6-year-old child runs up into my arms after and is like, I want to be a farmer. This beautiful Black child with these beautiful, big, puffy, like hair, bow things. And it's like, I want to be a farmer like you. It's like, I can't quit,
Sure. Yeah. I don't have why. I'm sure it's different.
What gets me out of bed in the morning? A hot cup of tea. That's a very. But I so enjoy the stories and the ability to be connecting with so many different people that have this aspiration to be in agriculture. So that's what gets me up. I actually tell people that I don't like to talk about my job too much because I feel like I'm getting paid to do something fun, So I really I enjoy that connection to people.
Yeah, it's tough. It's hard. It was 10 degrees this morning. But for me, it's reclaiming my own agency around stuff. I get to pick what I'm gonna do today, right? Sometimes the animals pick it for me, but I get to choose. And it's not in a spirit of exploitation. And whatever labor I'm putting in, I'm able to help other people reclaim that part of their own food system, their own stories, right? So even if I'm providing, some, the variety of collards that they ate, that was really similar. I cook a curry or something. People get to say, "Oh, I remember that. That was my my mother used to cook. My mother's curry is way better than this, but it reminds me." And it's just making those connections because I didn't see myself as part of a food system. I was just the recipient of whatever package was thrown at me, whatever my mother was able to put together. So allowing more people and communities to be involved in their own self-agency is like really important for me.
Okay, so Leah describes a common phenomenon that Manor students are familiar with and see in our peers of color at Cornell, saying that Black and brown people can confuse oppression on land with the land itself and their ancestral traumas associated with agriculture. First, in your opinion, why is this mindset important to dismantle? And secondly, how have you seen this mindset manifested? So Manor students are familiar with the saying that Black and brown people can confuse oppression on land with the land itself, and like ancestral trauma. So in your opinion, why is this mindset important to dismantle?
I think one important distinction is it's really up to us to dismantle that for ourselves as Black and brown people. I wouldn't want anyone who doesn't identify that way to walk away and be like, I really gotta like tell Black people that they should be on the lands and they shouldn't be traumatized. It's like that's our own healing that we get to do. And what we found that works really well for that is when we are in community on the land. So being just like the one Black farmer in a sea of white on a WOOF program, that's going to be re-traumatizing. But when it's 15 or 20 of us in a program together and we can balance out the learning on the land with reflection, with dance, storytelling, song, all of our ancestral ways of healing, that gives opportunity to imprint a new memory of the earth that eventually becomes stronger than that inherited sort of epigenetic trauma memory of the earth. But that's kind of our work. So like the work of communities who aren't Black and brown is reparations. It's the work of giving back stolen land, giving back stolen resources, making sure that all the programs here are accessible, all of that, right? And then our internal work, I really think, is that undoing of trauma.
I think it's so important not to start from trauma too, but not to ignore it. It shows up and trauma shows up most often at the site of the crime. And a lot of times that's inland. When you go, I'm sure the amount of people who come out from, we get students that come up from New York City to visit the farm. And the first thing they do when they get off the bus or they get off the car, whatever, They look around and they're frightened. And I'm like, well, what's going on with y'all? Like, hi, you know, and it's just like, the first thing everyone says is quiet, right? And the just silence is frightening, right? Because that can mean anything. They think something's out to get them. It could be a bear. It could be a white man in the woods, like all kinds of like boogeymen that we have. And it only shows up at the site of the crime. And it's so important to reclaim those spaces and just say, well, you know, that the trauma is not present at the moment, right? That predator isn't out to get you. And if he is, he's got to get through me first, you know? But it's really digging and finding our own history. I wanted to give a shout out really quick to Dr. I want to make sure you get the name right, Dr. Austin Curtin, right? Because a lot of times we talk about George Washington Carver, but Dr. Curtin he studied here at Cornell University. He was a soil scientist, and he was also Dr. Carver's partner in research, and the person who he ultimately bequeathed all of his patents and research to. And he studied here, right? How many people knew that happened, right? Why isn't that a thing? We need to talk about this. We need to reclaim the history in our own spaces. And once we're able to do that, we're able to participate, right? Because that was me, and there I am, right? So just get in those spaces.
So I think those are all extremely important points about that, reclaiming the connection with the land in a positive way, but still recognizing the past. And I know that with some of the work that I've done around youth is also connecting them with green spaces right in their urban environments, because the more rural areas can be really traumatizing for the first time. I remember doing work with inner city schools in Philadelphia, and going to rural forests, even just, you know, and outside of Philadelphia, was a very scary experience for some of the kids who had never really been in like a kind of not even a really remote area. And so even urban farming and really thinking about a lot of the natural areas in cities and connecting those, and also creating that new narrative, you know, restoring these places and creating these kinds of positive experiences, and meeting particularly youth where they are in that process.
So this question is, how can we as consumers and you all as researchers be activists for Black and Latinx folk in agriculture?
So I think that one community that lives among us in New York State and active in agriculture that's been largely not, I think, celebrated as assets and amazing contributors to our food security are our Latino, Latinx farm workers. And so one really big project that we've started is really focusing on creating pathways for them to move from fieldwork into management, into ownership. We know that we can start with very small gains of helping them build the confidence and the ability to communicate and be leaders within their current employment situation. But the aspiration is that they, over time, develop whole new relationships. And so I feel like in some ways it's, who do we have among us already that have the skills and the ability and the interest, and then how do we help them find their way?
I'll say briefly, I dislike the framework of consumer, right? Because I think that's something that we have to undo too. I see everybody who's a recipient of the goods from the farm, whether it's education or food, as a co-producer. This is someone who's helping produce a different food system. And whatever it takes to strengthen their agency and able to do that, whether it's more funds in their pocket or just more decision-making processes for them to participate in is helpful.
Part of the question was about researchers. I think there's a deep importance for those of us who are on faculty here at Cornell to be finding and supporting and educating a new generation of researchers, a new generation of scholars. And many of the young people who come here, I guess I can say young people, many of them are in their 30s or even 40s when they come to do a graduate degree here at Cornell, are looking to be a different kind of scholar. And we need to hear that, and we need to recognize that and see that, and to help them to achieve that. We've had some wonderful examples in the past few years, one of whom was Bobby Smith, who came through our department, who worked with many people here in the room, including Rafa, who's now at the University of Illinois doing a postdoc and in the process of being offered a position to stay there as a permanent faculty member. So I think we need to be, the point I want to emphasize here is the point about young people wanting to be a different kind of scholar, a different kind of researcher, to do that work differently. And we need to see that and hear that, and we need to go look for that and find it and support it at institutions like Cornell.
Well, I think that wraps up the time that we have for today. And so I want to thank our panelists for joining us and thank all of you for being with us. And Leah, thank you also so much for making time and sharing your stories and wisdom with all of us and inspiring this conversation. And Marquand for being moderator, yes. And
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.